Good afternoon, and thank you for being here in this diplomatic symphony where former ambassadors have a discussion on North American cooperation. And we are going to have, here to my left is Pierre Allais, the former ambassador of Canada to Mexico. Next to him, Ambassador Antonio Garza. He was ambassador from the United States to Mexico. Then Jerónimo Gutiérrez, former ambassador of Mexico to the United States, and Dionisio Pérez Jacome, former ambassador of Mexico in Canada. Thank you all for being here. You have met for the past couple of years in a reunion called Convocation. Jerónimo, could you please tell us what Convocation is?
Sure. So a little over three and a half, maybe 4 years ago, a group of former ambassadors and along with the U.S.-Mexico Foundation got together, started to, as a way to think about initially about the U.S.-Mexico relationship and try to also, provide support to governments in a very, disinterested way. So that's the short story of how Convocation began. We have been meeting since then every year. It's if the number of former U.S. ambassadors to Mexico and vice versa might be around, I don't know, maybe around 25, 30 that are alive, and we've the whole group meets, or a big number of us, and what we try to do is, again, assess a little bit of where things are and try to come up with a report. So it's largely a reflection. But I would say, and last year we actually started to make it trilateral, which I think it was a very important step. And that is why Dionisio and Pierre thankfully joined us this year actually. What I would, that's sort of the formal explanation. But what I guess, Convocation is about two things. It's a group of people that have been deeply involved in the North American relationship and that believe in it. And I would say that the other thing that unites us is that we've all suffered it, fell in love with it, and make mistakes in our positions, as former ambassadors. And I think, not to be presumptuous, but I think there's a fair amount of experience accumulated there that we have tried to put to the services of the people that are now taking decisions.
Okay, now Convocation is one of these reunions. You want to say something?
No, I was only going to add just a very addendum to it. One of the things that I think the U.S.-Mexico Foundation has done extraordinarily well and characterizes Convocation is provide some continuity in terms of the policy recommendations and the advocacy from the perspective of a practitioner. And I think, sometimes that's lost when you go to a lot of these policy forums or some really great think tanks. These are recommendations from people that have been someone on the front lines. My first impression was it was going to be the El Club de Yo Fui, kind of in a has-beens deal where we all sit around and we talk about. But I think it's actually been very constructive, and I've got to give a lot of credit to the U.S.-Mexico Foundation for their leadership on it.
I mean, I feel I agree with you, with both of you, talking about how all of this is necessary to have a framework to work to solve the mutual problems better. But I find that North America right now, and has been for a while, a dysfunctional family that gather sometimes during the year, and when politicians, diplomatics, academics reunite and talk about North America, they get to certain accords, but at the end, I don't know if everybody then goes back to their own countries and look at what we have now. We have Biden today talking about giving money to build the wall when he had said that was not going to happen. Then I received this from the U.S.-Mexico Foundation yesterday. I'm sure you won't see, but you'll get the picture. This is very easy. This chart shows in green the Canada and United States commerce. It's just that something that you can see. And then underneath is the Mexico-US commerce. And here, I thought this was the horizontal axis, but very close to the horizontal axis is the Mexico-Canada commerce. It's nothing. It looks like we have two sets of bilateral relations that have nothing to do. There's no trilateral. It's Mexico and the US, US and Canada. So I just want to pick your minds on this.
No, that's a fair comment in my view. But let's not forget that during the first NAFTA, the commerce between Mexico and Canada multiplied by 4. So we started from almost nothing. So, and it's true that we are very complementary and we can do better actually. But if you look at I believe that North America has become the most efficient trading platform in the world, bar none. If you look at the numbers, there's about $3 million a minute of trade between the three countries. So, and that's huge. That's 1.5 million coming from Mexico to the United States, 1.5 million a minute almost from Canada to the United States. And it represents about 39% of the Mexican GDP. So that's been a huge success. But I agree with your comment that, we're a dysfunctional family, and even more so now. I think we have leaders in the three countries that are not really interested in making North America the main objective of their government in terms of foreign policy and trade policy. So it is a sad moment, but I remain very optimistic.
Super. Now,
a couple of extra comments here. I think you mentioned the data from Mexico and Canada. If you look at the US and Canada data, it's basically the same. It's a mirror. So what we have is that the trade with US dominates the trilateral agenda. Mm-hmm. So now that doesn't mean in the case of the Canada-Mexico relationship that we haven't advanced. Actually, as Pierre was mentioning, if we go back to the signing of the NAFTA and look at where we are today, we have increased by 12 times or more the trade. But compared to the US, it's very small relatively. It's less than 5% of the total trade in both the case of US and Canada and Mexico, whereas the bilateral relationship or trade with the US is 80-85%. Now, I just close by saying that despite this situation, there is a lot of complementarity that can be exploited. And so we are talking about NAFTA. It dominates the agenda. But it's also important, or the way I like to see it, is that building on the bilateral relations also help us move towards the trilateral relation. It's a way of continue to move forward. So we need to keep in mind what we can do in each sphere.
Thank you, Dionisio. Ambassador Garza,
well,
what do you think is a way where this dysfunctional family could work towards a better scenario?
And I'm not well read enough to know, but that old line about every family is dysfunctional in its own way, right? We happen to be screwed up in a very good way. If you think about it, sure, we're screwed up. And we are because we do such a tremendous volume of economic activity. So you're going to have challenges. We are very complementary. We do $15 million of trade a minute or some ridiculous amount. You're going to have bumps along the way. We wouldn't have security issues if we didn't have some of the most, quite frankly, attractive markets for good and for bad. I mean, and some of the challenges that go with that. Immigration is because people want to move to opportunity, and we're creating it in this. So it's there. I think the way we've met that dysfunctionality historically, and it's getting more difficult because of the intransigence that we see in the political arena in all three countries at different times, is that the private sector, those people that have invested in the different countries, have stakes in trade, have stakes in USMCA, have a stake in this North American platform. And so I think that's what allowed, in spite of leadership that wasn't leading at times, they had to listen to their private sectors. Now we're at a moment where I think increasingly it's not just the economic imperative, but if you look at the comments of the last Economic Forum, the one before the one last week, where they laid out the whole notion of chips as sort of something that we have to concentrate on in North America. To me, that was interesting because it was the first time that we both, the economic overlaid with the geopolitical. And it was one of those moments where you said, if we're smart in the United States, we not only start to see Mexico as an economic partner, but we see it as a geopolitical ally. So there was an alignment of interest that have not historically been aligned in a way that I think is good. So yeah, certainly there's some dysfunctionality, but in spite of all that, there's been a tremendous amount of integration. And in spite of all that, Mexico is still, I think, in a position to be geopolitically very relevant to North America.
Thank you. Jerónimo Gutierrez, what about you? What do you think is a good way to move forward? This that Ambassador Garza talks about, do you think Mexico, for example, is taking advantage of the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act the way it should, or how could it do it better?
Ana Paula, I think that there's a gap between, if you look at the narrative that comes out of the meetings, we're not a dysfunctional family. Everything looks good and dandy. It's all aligned. I'm often, happy about the fact that you see President López Obrador talking about supply chains and North America, something that, let me put a little bit of spice into the conversation, would have been unthinkable 20 years ago, no? He actually supported USMCA deeply. He's, so the narrative, I think, is very well. It looks good. I think there's a big gap between the narrative and the execution of some of the things that we're talking about, and that's a problem. I think that based upon my experience, you need a lot of, systematic follow-up to get things done once the leader meets. That's one. I think that to some extent, all of the leaders are, if you really want to know how the relationship between the North American partners is going, or for that matter, how is the relationship between the United States and Mexico going, the best indicator to me is whether either one, on each side is willing to pay political costs. To me, that's a sign of that the relationship is well, because there's often domestic political cost involved. And that is not where we're seeing right now. And I think that when North America has taken important steps is because the leaders were willing to take heat and get some, costs domestically because they needed to push that agenda. Having said that, I think that the relationship overall is very resilient. I mean, let me again put a little bit of spice and not to get too partisan, but it endured, we have endured, the North American relationship is relatively new, let's say a quarter of a century. And it has endured a lot during that time. We just recently endured some very bumpy years of the Trump administration. We're enduring some bumpy years with the AMLO administration. If somebody's, and I think that just shows that the notion is very resilient, largely because of what Ambassador Garza just said, because there's a lot of stake, because the private sector is very involved, and because even if the governments are mess up, there's a lot of people that are willing to stand up and say, no, you have to stay the course, we have to be there. And I think that's what keeps us going.
Yeah, and to complement what Jerónimo just said, let's not forget that 2024 is presidential election in Mexico and in the United States. So I'm afraid that the North American agenda will take the back burner. We're supposed to have the NALS, the North American Leaders Summit, by December. It won't happen. It's not going to happen. We don't even have dates yet. So that's how little important it has become to our leaders at this point in the political time calendar, if you want to put it that way. So let's not hope for 2024. Let's look at longer vision, 5 years or 10 years on the road. And I'd like to remember the people in the room here that we met in April for 45 hours, and now we're trying to resume all this in 45 minutes. So it's a bit difficult. Our apologies for that.
Yeah. Although, Pierre, You said Mexico will be on the back burner, or the United States will be on the back burner. I think that would actually be a good outcome. I don't want to see Mexico front and center in the U.S. elections in 2024. I'm not going to lie to you. I'd love to see it not talked about. That means things are generally not being politicized and the rhetoric is not so over the top that it's hard to walk back once you're elected. Conversely, in Mexico, I don't want to see that nationalism play into the sort of things that, that really they feed each other. And sadly, they feed each other very conveniently if you're in the political arena, because I don't know who else on this panel has run for office before, but there's an old line. It takes $10 to make you love me, $1 to make me hate the opponent. And this extreme rhetorical stuff whips up constituencies and keeps them intact, and then you want to hang on to them. So it's going to be a tough year. The reason I think, and Jeronimo hit on a good point, you don't see an arena currently where people are willing to pay a political cost because the costs are too high. You go back a handful of years, and Clinton paid a cost, Bush paid a cost, at different times. I don't know that Obama's tenure had too many hot button issues, but the costs were relatively modest, and they could manage them because the constituency in support of this relationship and trade was still much larger. That constituency is kind of shrinking. And I think it's incumbent upon people to educate others about the importance of the relationship and broaden the constituency so that the cost isn't so large.
I do want to speak more about 2024 and concurring elections in Mexico and the United States, but not to do the same that I'm complaining and leaving the Mexico-Canada relationship in a second place. I want to ask you, Ambassador Perez-Jacome, I know what Ambassador Pierre said. I understand that commerce between Mexico and Canada has grown with NAFTA, but still it's worth $38 billion in 2022. And Canada and the United States in that same year traded $793 billion. So really, I just want to ask you, how do you see the relationship, the bilateral relationship, or how can we insert Mexico and Canada more towards being more of a partner looking to the future?
Let me start by saying a lot of the trade goes through the US, by the way. So if you look at the statistics from Mexico and then look at the statistics from Canada, they are different. Why? Because they measure their imports, their respective imports, as coming from the US. So you need to look at the exports of both countries to understand the size of the actual trade, and it makes that the numbers you mentioned go up. Now, I talked about the complementarity. There are many areas where trade is advancing, where it makes natural and logical sense to continue to deepen it. Agriculture, for example, we import a lot of canola oil and meat and other natural resources, talking about agricultural products. But if you look at what Mexico exports right now, 90% of the berries, 90% of the strawberries, 80% of tomatoes, 70% of the avocados that are consumed in Canada come from Mexico. There is a huge opportunity to move ahead in the value chain by entering into joint processing of agribusiness. But I'm just referring to one sector. I could talk a lot about manufacturing. In the auto sector, we are perfectly integrated. In many other, in transportation. In terms of investment, I think there's a lot that could be done. Canada is the third largest investor in Mexico, but Mexico only has $6 billion invested in Canada, Mexican firms. Now, what can we do? We have the Canadian pension funds, for example, that offer a great platform for investing in transport or in real estate, in many other sectors. There's a common relationship between the stock exchanges. The Toronto Stock Exchange is welcoming many businesses. And we can get into more niche type opportunities for small and medium enterprises. Let me just close this intervention by saying the agenda is huge. The private sector has a lot to offer, to put in the table. Let's not wait for the government to do everything. I mean, they are doing a lot. They have the Canada-Mexico partnership. They have many other instances. But the private sectors are already engaged in the high-level business dialogue, which is reflecting in some interesting things. And the state governments also. Not only is a federal government relationship. So if you look at everything, the panorama is positive, although
that's
small.
Good. That's good news. Good to hear. Tony Garza, you want to speak?
Well, just to echo what Dionisio said, and it's critical that the private sector stay engaged at the high level economic forums and really more broadly. During the negotiation of USMCA, I was actually quite concerned because essentially you had two individuals and a third that was, I think Canada actually at the end of the day, Canada really was the big player and managed to kind of keep things moving in a very constructive direction, because you had in Mexico and the United States two people that were not essentially free traders and put a lot at risk there. That they came to an agreement at the end, I think, was actually, a big sigh of relief. And people that were critical of the process, if you'll pardon me this expression, I've lived here for 20 years, but I'm still originally from Texas. People that were critical of it, I said, don't criticize the dog because it didn't dance well. Applaud it because it danced at all. Mm-hmm. And that's what you had. You had a process that shouldn't have worked and came to the end. Now, we'll go into 2026 after two elections, and I'm concerned on the sunset that the stakes may be even higher, and it's going to be more critical to see that engagement that we're talking about. And I wonder if they're up to the battle again. I certainly hope they are. And I think that's where this whole notion of Mexico as a geopolitical asset may come into play in a way that's positive.
Leave it to the Canadians to be the nice guys in the room, no?
Well, no, I think they were critical in moving that process.
Well, actually, I was deeply involved in that process, and it's true. I have to admit something, and Jeronimo was also deeply involved. Canada and Mexico worked very, very well together, but that was behind the scene. So sometimes you have the impression the locomotive was the American, but the relationship between the government of Mexico and the government of Canada during those 14, 15 critical months was fantastic, actually. I would have access to the Minister of Economy 2-3 times a week, which an ambassador usually does not have. So it worked very well. And I just wanted to add a point to Dionisio. We often forget that there's about 2.3 million Canadians visiting Mexico every year. That's 5% of the Canadian population. We need to improve that, not in terms of number, but in terms of diversity of what they see. Because Canadians, they come to Mexico, say, of course I know Mexico. I flew to Cancun, a bus picked me up at the airport, I went to a resort, and the bus brought me back to the airport, and I flew back to Montreal or Toronto, whatever it was. We need to expand this to a more cultural approach, to a more global approach for these 2-3 million Canadians willing to come to Mexico years after year. It's a repeat business. I know Canadians have been here every year for 25, 30 years. So we need to use these pot of gold to expand the relationship between Canada and Mexico. But at the end of the day, the reality is that we have an elephant in the middle, and we need to deal with the elephant all the time also.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about an elephant, what a great word to use, because I'm going to ask Jeronimo about the Republicans. And
you should ask Tony.
I'd rather hear what you have to say.
So to get us back into 2024, how should Mexico approach what we know is going to happen? We are going to be the political piñata for the Republican Party, and you here are diplomats. How should diplomacy help us transit these, which are going to be, for sure, choppy waters?
So Tony mentioned the sunset clause and the review of 2026. And I think he has a very important point, because what I see happening, if we're not careful on all sides, and with respect to Mexico, is that Mexico is going to be in a very tough position for the following reasons. On the Democrat side, there's a lot of irritation, or some irritation, on two fronts. labor, and the environment. And we're going to have on the Republican side a lot of irritation on two sides, fentanyl and immigration. And those things are not obviously up for discussion as USMCA gets reviewed. The problem is that the political players in the system are going to hang into the Christmas tree of the USMCA review everything. And I think we have to be careful with that because that's a very likely scenario. There was recently published, now going a little bit more to your question of the Republicans, there was recently a poll that was published in The Economist. It's really from US, I think it's called usgov.com. They have, it's an open source polling, and they have been polling the US population on vis-a-vis different countries. And the opinion that the population has. And they separated by party lines, Democrats, Republicans, size, and education. And the one that was published at The Economist, we are, the number of Republicans that now see Mexico as an ally is the same as the number that sees it as an enemy. And it's quite impressive. I have seen the Republican Party evolve hugely over the last 20 years. It's not the same Republican Party that was present, even 20 years ago, 15 years ago. There is deep, I would say, socioeconomic causes for that within the United States that we have to understand. President Trump is a result of something deeper that is going on. It's more a result than the cause. And people don't often realize that, and the causes are still there. So even if he's not running again, or he ends up he'll run, but even if he doesn't win, those same causes will continue to be there. And so I think, we've always been the piñata, and the United States has always been the piñata. When President Lopez, with all due respect, but with all President Lopez Obrador often in the Mañanera mentions that, it really doesn't matter because there's a campaign and that's true. It has always happened to some extent. It happens both sides. We also use the United States in our own political piñatas. I think the president also to some extent. But I think it's never been as bad. To be honest, I think it's reached a level where I think it's worrisome. And how to solve it, and there are plenty of more diplomats here than could offer, I think, surely more better advice than me here. But the first thing starts to speaking to them. And we're not doing that enough. We're talking to the traditional players, whether in DC or other states, and we need to go to the nitty-gritty of where the Republican hardliners are, and it doesn't help some of the narrative that is coming out of Mexico also.
Dionisio, I know that you were ambassador to Canada, but do you want to pitch in to this?
It's a fascinating topic, and it's all interconnected. So
exactly.
No, just building on what Jerónimo just mentioned, I think, and going back to your initial question about Convocation 3.0, one of the most important outcomes that I took from Convocation was this willingness of a group of individuals that share a vision to think about actions directed towards making this vision a reality. It's going to be a tough year, 2024, mainly in those countries, Mexico and the US, where we have elections, we know that. But so if you read the report, you will find some interesting recommendations, and these are some of them very obvious, obviously. We need to keep lines of communication open, but not only at the top level, we need to find key individuals in different levels, from cabinet, from undersecretaries, with state governors, within the different parties. And we need to have a constant dialogue. We need to make sure that people in both countries are trusted and that we develop this sense of confidence, because it's going to be put at stake during the next year. We need to have a strategy to get to the candidates through the right means, obviously, and then to the elected officials in order for them to understand that a shared vision and the fact that a common vision and as the document says, of a shared challenge that we have. So, and for this, it's not only the diplomats, I think it's everyone can contribute, the private sector. Just if we look at how NAFTA was negotiated and all the lobbying efforts that Jerónimo had to coordinate in the US, for example, I think we could use that right now to get to the people and send the right messages and talk about the vision of prosperity, that in order to be reached, we need to find a way of moving through migration and security issues and all the politicization and polarization that we will experience.
Thank you, Dionisio. Now, you talk about security, and I feel we need to talk about fentanyl and the crisis that means for the North American region. There's consumption in all 3 countries, and there's the idea that Mexico is the bridge to export the precursor or even the fentanyl to the US. Ambassador Garza, what is your take on this crisis? I feel it has grown very fast and out of control.
It's been 5 seconds on what Jerónimo and Dionisio said. I would be reluctant to say that the advocacy for Mexico in the United States has to come from Mexicans. I would say activate your allies in the country, and that's where the voices need to be coming from. No more than Mexicans wanted to hear from me during the political cycle 6-8 years ago. God, more than that, 15 years ago. But on the fentanyl, I think one of the things that we have to kind of start to appreciate is just how enormous the challenge is. I grew up in an era where, of marijuana. You could smoke yourself stupid and hungry, but you weren't going to kill yourself, right? And the enormity, just the market. To make any money on marijuana, you had to be moving tons. To make any money on heroin, you had to be or cocaine, you had to be moving enormous amounts. To make money on fentanyl, tiny little amounts. So we're no longer looking sort of where's the haystack, where's the needle in the haystack? We're looking for the eye of the needle in the haystack. And one of the things we really limit ourselves in this sort of transnational thing when we tie one hand behind our back, and that's a failure of cooperation. And I think a lot of it has been the way the issue has been framed. In the United States, we're pointing our fingers at Mexico. Mexico is causing this problem. In Mexico, the United States is consuming it. What we have in the United States is an enormous health problem. An enormous tragedy being visited on community after community after community because of these drugs and the impact that they have in our communities. And we have to acknowledge that. It's an enormous challenge. But what Mexico also has to acknowledge is it's not just a transport country. Mexico has an enormous challenge to its sovereignty. All Mexican presidents have been very quick to protect the sovereignty of the United States when it came to any comments out of the United States. But this is an issue of protecting the sovereignty of Mexico vis-a-vis its own domestic cartels. And so I think we would be well served by taking a step back and saying, okay, the United States has a health problem, Mexico has a sovereignty problem. How are we going to start to address this in cooperation? Now, there's a lot of practical things, and I know the convocation that were discussed about, the designation of precursors and these sorts of things. But it's further complicated by the whole China situation, something that I think Mexico feels less strongly about than the United States in terms of the threat of China. So you have this health problem, this threat to Mexico's sovereignty, you have the specter of China, and you don't have nearly the level of cooperation, although I'm hopeful that today that they started to take some steps. You started this conversation, Ana Paula, by talking about the dysfunctional, and once, 2 or 3 times a year, we all say nice things and this sort of thing. But the very fact that those meetings are being had, I think, is important.
Yes,
and it's not just the top level. In the United States, and here, this last administration has been very critical of the word bureaucracy. That is not an offensive word to me. Those are the people day in and day out that make the relationship work. Those are the professionals at their desk that have to continue to communicate and transcend one administration to the other. back to the question, fentanyl's not going away anytime soon because the incentives are so large, and the capacity to addict is almost instantaneous. And that's fentanyl. Carfentanil, which is in the wake of that, is even more brutal. And so today's meeting, good, things that need to be done, but we all both have to acknowledge this is Mexico's sovereignty problem, and it's our health disaster, tragedy.
And the lack of a strong state in Mexico that enforces the law, no?
Yeah, I mean, that's a sovereignty issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was very much part of the conversation we had Convocation about the lack of rule of law. But every time we were changing subject, rule of law was coming back. In every chapter, rule of law was always there. But what I'd like to add to Tony's comment, and sorry, Ambassador Cass's comment, is that Canada is also a net exporter of fentanyl. So let's not think that this is a bilateral issue. This is clearly a North American trilateral issue that we need to solve together. And China is really much at the center of that conversation. So it's, as Tony said, it's a hugely complex issue that's not going away. But please do not exclude Canada from the conversation.
Oh, no.
We have to be part of the solution. We have really much to be part of the solution.
We are running out of time.
Just
so
very quickly, Ana
yes.
Paula, just a comment dovetailing on what has been said. I think that fentanyl is a game changer for the region. I think that the status quo of what we're doing, a bit of what Tony said on cooperation. I mean, I don't doubt the goodwill of the U.S., Canada, or Mexico to try to address this. I think it's there. It's there from the governments. It's there from the leaders. But the status quo is not going to get us through. I think there needs to be a huge change in terms of cooperation on security. I think that it goes as far as creating, there was recently an article, I don't know if you read it, about actually going to a treaty that creates a sort of a trilateral force that does that. The discussion, just to be sure, in the United States that is taking place about armed interventions and the like is obviously unacceptable. Opposed, it's a bad idea. It's unacceptable. It's against international law, everything, but it's very real.
Yes.
It's never been as real as it is.
It's very real, it's very visceral, and it's very short-sighted.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And it wouldn't be effective any
No.
more than the wall or sending troops.
But there
or
needs to
just-
be a step forward that really transcends the level of cooperation that we have right now. I just want to, I believe that, again, it's not, we're not going to be able to make it through simply by meeting, as we speak right now, the cabinet, you have Attorney General Garland, Mayorkas, Blinken, and a bunch of people of security, and probably have the Mexican cabinet sitting down. We will know in a few moments or hours the results. But I think it's at a point that we've never seen before.
This guy was the best undersecretary Mexico's ever had, in my opinion. We worked together for 5 or 6 years and had conversations that were fluid, that were open, he stuck his finger in my chest when he thought I was wrong. But sometimes you have to be able to do that. And I think that's what we need on this issue, because it is that critical and overwhelming right now.
And what Tony said, not to return the compliment or also to return it, but this issue it's about our sovereignty. It's our sovereignty, the Mexican sovereignty vis-a-vis the cartels. And just one thing to be a little bit critical, and I know we have running short of time, but the fact that we still formally don't have a conclusion or the same view about whether fentanyl is produced here or not.
Yes, it says a
it's
lot.
worrisome, no?
No, and if you look at the papers in the U.S., Dallas Morning News ran a story every day during September on fentanyl addictions, personal stories on fentanyl. New York Times has run so many stories of horror about what's going on in Portland or in other parts of Oregon where now it's legal to consume. And I feel that is something that gets to most Americans' homes, those stories. And it's different from migration, which probably is a story that you feel in the border. And maybe in some cities like New York City, Chicago, that's where migration gets to. But fentanyl, I feel it's something that is getting to everybody's home. And the story is we are in this problem because of Mexico. So when I say This is a dysfunctional family. I really think with these type of meetings and the convocation and what the U.S.-Mexico Foundation does is indispensable, and it's not. It's great, and it's a.
Although we have to be honest, a lot of the fentanyl is an outgrowth of the opioid crisis that was in Mexico.
Yeah.
That was when we pretty much drove ourselves in the U.S.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm just.
No.
I mean, I'm not one of those I'm not one of those people who's quick to point the finger. We drove a lot of the opioid crisis domestically in the United States.
With the OxyContin.
Yes, and all this sort of thing.
Distribution. So I just want to see if you want to make some closing remarks. We are on the hour. Pierre, would you like to start?
Yes, of course I'll start. I think we all agree that there's a need for a much deeper trilateral cooperation, and not only in the economic and trade issue. It goes beyond that. It's about arms trafficking. It's about transnational criminal organizations. It's about fentanyl. It's about education. It's about labor mobility. It's about reskilling our workers. There's so much to be done. And I agree with my colleagues here. We cannot leave that to our leaders. It has to go down several levels. It has to go down to a working level where people will believe and do it every day. We cannot say about this North American Leaders Summit in Montreal or Toronto in February, they're going to talk for a day and a half and then everything will be solved. That doesn't happen that way. So we need to create teams in every government that will focus on the trilateral relationship. And let's face it, it's not only about North America. It's about keeping North America the leader. Now, we need to remain competitive, and all this needs to be addressed.
It's a win-win situation.
Absolutely. Win-win-win.
Exactly, win-win-win.
Yeah.
Ambassador Tony Garza.
We are very definitely in the age of misinformation and disinformation. And everyone in this room today and across this conference is here because they want information. Now the challenge is to disseminate it. It is much harder to disabuse somebody of something they think they heard that on some visceral level appeals to it. But that's the challenge of I think, that all of us have in North America. So my closing remark would be, don't always feel comfortable just talking to the choir. Put yourself in your zone of discomfort by talking to people that you may not agree with or may not see eye to eye with on these issues, because they're critical to the future of North America and to the three countries.
Thank you. Jerónimo?
Related to this point, when we met last time in Convocation, we discussed a little bit about the importance of knowing better the opinion. I mean, we have a good sense of, some sense, not even a good sense of what the population think about the North American, to what extent they feel North American, to what extent and we don't really have that more information. And I think Tony's right, but we need to produce better understanding of how the people in the three countries are. And that's an exercise for academia, for universities, to constantly poll and take the pulse of how our three populations are viewing the North American debate, in order to really understand and see what to do, and not having it be a experts, topic of discussion every year, but something that goes deeper into society.
Thank you. Dionisio?
Well, I think I agree with all of them. I think I would just close by saying we need to find a way to disseminate the North American vision, which is at risk. Next year is going to be a tough one. It's going to be difficult to reach agreements because of no one will assume the political cost that Jerónimo was talking about. But we need to keep the dialogue going, and we need to find a way to continue building trust. And for that, I think it's important to keep it in a North American framework that is including Canada. It helps to look at the problem in a comprehensive way. And also, it is important to incorporate every stakeholder possible, including academia, business sector, and different, and find a way to get to the common people.
Thank you to all four ambassadors, and thanks to all of you who have joined us.